Welcome back, reviewers, to our study of the Russian Revolution. This video will be looking at the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, which happened on the 6th of January 1918. You can see there in the image a photo of a crowd of people, and that is a photo of the deputies of the Constituent Assembly taken on the 5th of January 1918 by P.A. Ozup. The Constituent Assembly sat for exactly 1 day. It opened its proceedings on the 5th of January and then it was dissolved by Lenin and the Bolsheviks on the 6th of January 1918. So let's see why Lenin decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. There is an image there of Lenin in 1918. In order to understand why Lenin dissolved the Constituent Assembly, we need to have an understanding of the chronology of events. So let's look at that chronology now. Okay. So firstly, the elections for the Constituent Assembly were held on the 12th of November 1917, and they were held after the October 1917 revolution. The planning for them had occurred prior to the revolution. If Lenin could have stopped those elections from going ahead, he would have, but he couldn't. So he had to allow them to go ahead. When the results came in, you can see there, it wasn't very pleasant reading for the Bolsheviks. So out of the 717 seats that were voted for by the Russian population, 370 of those seats were won by the Socialist Revolutionaries, and 175 of those seats were won by the Bolsheviks. So the Social Revolutionaries, they had a majority of the seats, or the most seats out of all the different parties who sat deputies in the Constituent Assembly. And then that Constituent Assembly, and then the first sitting happened on the 5th of January 1918. And during that meeting, the Bolshevik Sverdlov told the Constituent Assembly that it was subservient to the Congress of Soviets and Sovnarkom. So the Congress of Soviets, controlled, I'll remind you, by the Bolsheviks, and then Sovnarkom was the government. The members of the Constituent Assembly were not happy about that, and they rejected that proposal or decree by 237 to 138 votes. So there must have been some abstentions as well. Many deputies abstaining. So Lenin ignored the Constituent Assembly's rejection of his decree, and he'd had enough of them pretty much, so he decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly in the early morning hours of the 6th of January 1918. Red Guards came in, they said the sitting has to finish. All the members were moved out and they closed the doors. They locked the doors of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly, if you have a look at that palace there, that's where it was held. And that is the Tauridi Palace. And it's a very, very interesting palace. It's got a lot of history to it. It was originally built, you can see there, between 1783 and 1789 by Catherine the Great for her confidant, Prince Potemkin, to celebrate his role in taking over the Crimean Peninsula for Russia from the Ottoman Turks. That name, Potemkin, that may ring some bells. The battleship Potemkin, the battleship was named after Prince Potemkin as well. So Prince Potemkin, a very famous Russian, played a big role during Catherine the Great's reign in Russia. Okay, and then we have a quick key quote there that gives an insight into Lenin's attitude towards the Constituent Assembly. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly by the Soviet government means a complete and frank liquidation of the idea of democracy by the idea of dictatorship. And that's from Michael Lynch. Okay, we're just talking about Lenin's attitude towards the Constituent Assembly. You can see the next bubble there. Let's look at that in more detail. So here we go. Lenin's attitude towards the Constituent Assembly. So first up, you have to understand Lenin feared the Constituent Assembly because that second point there, it was a legitimate authority in its own right. It had been voted into power by all male and female Russians over the age, I believe, of 18. So it was a democratically elected parliament. It was a legitimate authority in the eyes of the Russian people, and Lenin did not want to have to try to compete with that. We go to that first point up there. Yes, the Bolsheviks won the October Revolution and they overthrew the provisional government, but in the early months their power did not extend across all of Russia. Their power was limited pretty much to Petrograd and the areas surrounding Petrograd and the areas surrounding Moscow. So they did not have complete control over all of Russia, and as a result there are a number of groups within Russia who opposed them and their rule, and also so they were sort of trying to impose their authority upon these groups within Russia. But the Bolsheviks and Russia itself was still at war with Germany. So these were the competing factors or opposing forces that the Bolsheviks had to contend with, and the Constituent Assembly was another one. So Lenin wished to get rid of it. For Lenin, he argued that the Constituent Assembly was unnecessary because the people's will had already been expressed after the revolution by the creation of the Soviet government in October 1917. The Soviet government, Suvnarkom, which was created through the Petrograd Soviet. So for Lenin, from Lenin's point of view, the Petrograd Soviet and Suvnarkom was a democratic body. So he argued Russia did not need another democratic body, being the Constituent Assembly. Lenin also did not like the Constituent Assembly because he believed it was corrupt, as it still contained representatives of the bourgeoisie, for example, the cadets. If you have a look at this photo over here, this is Viktor Chernov. He is the leader of the Socialist Revolutionary Party and chairman of the Constituent Assembly. So he was the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, and he would have been elected into that position because the Socialist Revolutionaries had the most members within the Constituent Assembly. So the Socialist Revolutionaries therefore dominated the Constituent Assembly, and they could pass decrees and motions and get them through because the Bolsheviks did not have enough votes within the Constituent Assembly to stop them. Key quote here, which gives you a further insight into Lenin's attitude towards the Constituent Assembly. Lenin declared to hand over power to the Constituent Assembly would be to compromise with the malignant bourgeoisie. Nothing in the world will induce us to surrender the Soviet power. Okay, so once the Bolsheviks and Lenin dissolved the Constituent Assembly, what were the reactions of people to that, both within Russia and outside of Russia? Let's have a look. Reactions to the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. First up, it caused unease among some of Lenin's own supporters and foreign communists. Regardless of whether Russians were Bolsheviks or not, liberals and so forth, this idea of a democratically elected legislative parliament had gone right back to 1905 and earlier. If we remember right back to the 1905 revolution, Father Gapon's petition demanding creation of a legislative parliament, asking the Tsar to do that. It was also a key demand of the Union of Unions, which was set up by Milyukov and other liberals. And so it was a dream of intellectuals and, even many revolutionaries as well, this idea that they would have their own parliament, democratically elected with full lawmaking powers. And with Lenin's dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, he had pretty much crushed that dream, which so many Russians had been working towards for over 100 years. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly also contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War, and it turned many many groups within Russia against the Bolsheviks. The left socialist revolutionaries, we can see at this point, the left socialist revolutionaries led a series of uprisings in the spring of March to May of 1918. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly contributed to their split with the Bolsheviks. Early on, I remind you, after the October Revolution and prior to it, the left socialist revolutionaries had actually allied themselves with the Bolsheviks. That split really occurs in March 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the peace treaty between the Russians and the Germans, which Lenin convinces the Bolsheviks to sign with the Germans. The left socialist revolutionaries are not happy with that, and as a result, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they outlaw the left socialist revolutionaries, which doesn't help, which contributes to this series of uprisings, but also the actual dissolution of the Constituent Assembly is a key factor in turning the left socialist revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks. Furthermore, various alternative governments are formed. For example, in June 1918, Chernov forms a socialist revolutionary government on the Volga, and Tchaikovsky creates a socialist revolutionary government at Archangel with British support. So Archangel's that port up in the north, pretty much the Arctic Circle. Another consequence of the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly is there are a number of attempts on Lenin's life after this, but the one that comes closest to ending his life is when Dora Kaplan attempts to assassinate him on the 30th of August 1918. And we have an image here of her. There's still speculation about whether she was the actual perpetrator of this attempted assassination. Some historians believe it was somebody else. But regardless of whether she did it or not, she did admit to it when she was taken in by the Cheka, or the Russian police. She fired 3 shots at Lenin. The first shot passed through his coat, while the second and third shots hit him in the shoulder and the jaw. I believe they couldn't remove, they didn't try to remove the bullet from the jaw because it would have been, I think it was too close to an vein or an artery. Whatever the case was, he never fully recovered from the attack, and he had a series of strokes after this, which historians believe was caused by the bullets lodged in his jaw. And those strokes started in about 1922, and then he died in 1924. And this quote down here by Maxim Gorky gives a good understanding of how many Russians viewed the Bolsheviks' act of dissolving the Constituent Assembly. The best Russians have lived for almost 100 years with the idea of a Constituent Assembly as a political organ which could provide Russian democracy as a whole with the possibility of freely expressing its will. On the altar of this sacred idea, rivers of blood have been spilled, and now the People's Commissars have ordered the shooting of this democracy, which had manifested itself in honour of this idea. So Maxim Gorky, and Maxim Gorky is a very famous novelist or writer in Russia at that time. I think he may have been a one-time Bolshevik as well. Okay, and then finally, so that is our chronology, Lenin's attitude or reasons why he actually dissolved the Constituent Assembly, how other people felt about that dissolution and the reactions to it, and now we'll finally look at different historians' views about both the elections to the Constituent Assembly and the dissolution itself. So I've chosen 3 historical interpretations here. There are many more, but this gives us sort of a good overview of the historical debate about the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. We'll start with the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the HCPSU. And I'll just read that quote there. Further, it was necessary to destroy the survivals of the division of society into estates and the regime of national oppression, and to dissolve the bourgeois Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly, the elections to which had largely been held prior to the October Revolution and which refused to recognise the decrees of the Second Congress of Soviets on Peaceland and the transfer of power to the Soviets, was dissolved. So, for the HCPSU, the official party history of the revolution, it is arguing that it was justified to dissolve the Constituent Assembly because the Constituent Assembly was trying to block those key pieces of those key decrees that were passed by the Bolsheviks early on, the Decree on Peace, the Decree on Land, and also the Constituent Assembly was trying to stop the Soviet from ruling Russia, which from a Bolshevik viewpoint was the most purest form of democracy. A contrasting view is that of Richard Pipes. And Richard Pipes says, if the purpose of October remained concealed from nearly everyone, including rank-and-file Bolsheviks, there could be no doubt about Bolshevik intentions after January 5th, when they had made it unmistakably clear they intended to pay no heed to popular opinion. The evidence indicates that the industrial workers of Petrograd, even as they voted for the Bolshevik ticket, had expected the assembly to meet and give shape to the country's new political and social system. So for Richard Pipes, he argues that even though the Petrograd workers had voted for the Bolsheviks in the Constituent Assembly and obviously supported the Bolsheviks and Bolshevik rule, they also wanted to see the actual Constituent Assembly itself sit and pass laws and help create and shape the new social and political system within Russia after the revolution. Sheila Fitzpatrick has another view again. So let's have a look here. So the SR's overall victory was the result of winning the peasant vote in the villages, but there was a certain ambiguity in this. The peasants were probably single-issue voters, and the SR and Bolshevik programs on land were virtually identical. The SRs, however, were much better known to the peasantry. Their traditional constituency, where the peasants knew the Bolshevik program, their votes were split between the Bolsheviks and the SRs. So Sheila Fitzpatrick makes a very interesting point here, in the sense that she's stating that the actual election results. The actual election results perhaps were not as reflective of the Russian people's views of the Bolsheviks as they could have been, because the Bolsheviks had not had time to adequately educate the peasants about their program, about their land policy and so forth. And she's stating there that where they did have the time to actually talk to the peasants to tell them about their land policy, then the peasants were just as likely to vote for the Bolsheviks as they were for the SRs. Taking that a step further, if the Bolsheviks had had more time, she's perhaps arguing that the Bolsheviks would have gained a greater number of seats in the Constituent Assembly. If we remember back, the SRs had for years been working with the peasantry, with the peasants, trying to educate them and so forth, and promoting their views amongst the peasant population, where the Bolsheviks really only started doing that in 1917, and only really March, April 1917. Okay? So that is our discussion of the historical interpretations of the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. Let's go back now. Go back to the main screen. I hope you have a better understanding of, firstly, the reasons why the Constituent Assembly was dissolved, and then the consequences and so forth. Thank you for listening.